So I want to talk a little bit about something that Nicole talked about as well, and gave a lot of good context to, the AHI, or the Alexander Hamilton Institute. So I guess by a show of hands, who here has heard of the AHI before the past week? All right, that's a pretty good number of people. Yeah, so I think a lot of us have an idea of, they're an organization off campus, they're right-leaning, and if you get into a little bit of the history, they were founded in 2007 by a former history professor, Professor Bob Piquet. And he, ultimately, for over about the past, 2 decades at least, he's been sort of one of the pushing the very strong college campuses are left-wing indoctrination spaces. He's been pushing that agenda for a while. He wanted to get support from the school to support the foundation, but the majority of faculty were not supportive, given the fact that this would take, I believe that there were concerns about resources given to other departments. So he ultimately decided to found it separately and has devoted the majority of his time since then to that organization while teaching. Piquet was initially a Marxist, which is very interesting, but then he moved pretty far to the right when his advisor, who was of a similar background, also moved far to the right. And just to go into something that Nicole talked about a little bit before, not only did they get a significant amount of money from the Koch brothers over the 2010s, they got approximately $200,000 at least from one of the Koch brother foundations. They have a number of them across the country. They've also gotten a significant amount of money from the Linda and Harry Bradley Foundation, who has funded, I'm pretty sure they're not only very involved in fossil fuel interests, but they were also very much involved in funding the election overturning efforts of 2020 and 2021. And they got about $150,000 in only like 2 or 3 years, which is really interesting. So to get a little bit into sort of what their presence on campus has been like, or their relationship to the campus has been like, I believe the first sort of decade of their existence, they would hold events. They would, I'm not exactly sure when they founded Inquiry, which is the student paper, but that has been a very significant presence on this campus. They essentially, this is the one campus paper, and I believe we haven't been seeing it as much on campus before, but the one campus paper that is not run through the media board or any sort of sources directly through campus. They actually employ students to write in this, generally right to far right newspaper, which used to be distributed in the same place as the campus created newspapers, which the students who run those, unless someone can correct me if I'm wrong, are not similarly compensated. And over the past sort of decade, around 2017, there was a pretty notable incident with the history of the AHI, where they invited a speaker known as Paul Gottfried to campus. Now, Paul Gottfried, raise your hand if you've heard of the term alt-right. So that's Gottfried. So Gottfried, he's actually a Hungarian Jewish descent conservative thinker, and he immigrated right before the Holocaust when he was very young, and has been extremely conservative. He labeled himself as a paleoconservative. He tried to, essentially, his idea of the alternative right, as he called it, with Richard Spencer. Raise your hand if you've heard of him. Okay, he was the guy who organized Charlottesville, Unite the Right, all that kind of stuff, who's a pretty significant presence in the far right. The two of them actually worked together. And initially, Gottfried wanted the alt-right to be a conservative opposition to Bush, which is interesting to know. Going back the years before Gottfried was invited onto campus, I'm not really going to read these things directly, but he put out a number of, in either articles where he was interviewed or at a speech he gave in 2014, various extremely racist and anti-Semitic statements. There was a 2014 talk 3 years before he was invited to campus where he spoke, for example, about the influence of the Jewish lobby, and he made a statement about essentially Jews becoming secular and wanting to increase immigration to get revenge on the white Christian majority for the Holocaust. So this is a relatively far-right guy, and he's put out a number of these statements well before he was invited onto campus. So he was invited onto campus by Piquet, who was teaching at the time. very few other people knew, and then when students found out, there were a number of articles and statements opposing him speaking, given his background and given the ideology that he's put out. There were students who were protesting, there were students who showed up to events and talked to him and challenged his beliefs, and then after that, there were certain individuals within the AHI who would criticize students publicly and sort of go after them for both attempting to silence free speech, but then also writing similarly about when students were expressing their freedom of speech in dialogue with Gottfried to challenge his ideas, they didn't like that either. It's funny how freedom of speech works. So I guess to sort of get onto what's happened since then, Paquette resigned, and that's his sort of full-time thing now. He's primarily involved with the AHI. The inquiry I've been seeing it a lot less on campus. It used to be regularly put out. And in addition to sort of general right-wing commentary, there have been articles that have, for example, urged conservatives to support environmental efforts to tighten immigration restrictions and use that as a pretext to keep more people from coming into the country. And also articles calling Black Lives Matter protesters rabid dogs and things like that. So this is sort of the influence that they've had on campus. This is where they get their money from, and these are the people who they represent.